Hey crafters, today we're going to be diving into a very important question. Are ink refills a waste of money or are they necessary in your craft room? Let's face it, when I spend $5 to $10 on an ink pad, there's nothing more I would rather not do than buy an ink refill for another $5. It just seems to make the colors so expensive when you buy them at the same time. I'd much rather go ahead and buy a second color than buy an ink refill. Now for you guys today, I have a free downloadable graphic over on my blog, the link is below in the video description, that you can download on whether or not you should buy an ink refill for the ink pad that you have. Alright, so how do you know if your ink pad needs refilling aside from the obvious? It stamps and it's quite faded looking. One great thing, because it happens over time and you might not notice that your ink is actually running out, is to swatch your ink pads when you get them. Then I have a reference of how they looked when they were brand new. And then I can do a comparison after a few months if I feel like, hey, that ink has seen better days. So the first thing to consider whether or not you need a refill for your ink pad is to know whether your ink is a felt pad or a foam pad. For the longest time, felt pads have dominated the industry. They are a little bit on the harder side when you stamp, so you have to give it a good push to really get a good impression, but they tend to hold the inks for quite a long time. So for the most part, when it comes to felt pads, then I would say that you don't need to buy a refill, at least not for a very long time. But keep watching the video because we're going to talk about a few considerations to take into account when buying a felt pad, because you may actually decide to invest in the ink refill. Recently, there have been many companies who have started their own ink line, and they have all decided to go with foam pads. Now, what is the benefit of a foam pad and do you need a refill for them? Now, foam pads are obviously a lot softer, they're almost like a sponge. So when I go to stamp my stamp into them, it's going to sink in a little bit more, it's going to get a lot more color onto it. Now logically, if you're getting more color onto your stamp, which is a good thing at the end of the day, then it's going to require a lot more ink, and with felt pads, I always recommend to get a refill straight away. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't want to have these refills laying around for decades. If you're like me with a tiny space, that can be a little bit of an issue. However, don't worry, because in my next video, I'm going to be talking about techniques that you can do with ink refills, so to show you that they can be worth it when you purchase them. Now, as I said, felt pads really hold their color really well. I've had some of my felt pads for well over 5 years and I've never had to refill them. That has tremendous value. But there are certain things to take into consideration, whether you're doing felt or foam, as to how quickly you're going to need an ink refill. As we've already determined in today's video, for felt, I recommend not buying, however, maybe at a later date if needed. And for foam, I recommend straight away. So the first thing that you need to consider when you're purchasing an ink pad and whether or not to purchase a refill is, are these inks going to retire? So if you buy inks from companies like Stampin' Up! Or Close to My Heart, where they have a certain number of inks always in their catalog, and every year or every few years they bring in some new colors and retire the old, then you should probably consider grabbing yourself a refill. The next thing to consider is, are you using your ink pads for techniques? And by techniques, I mean things like blending backgrounds or direct to paper. Now, if you like to ink backgrounds, meaning you're dunking a sponge into your ink pad quite often, you're using a lot of ink to color your cardstock, I do this all the time, then definitely your inks are obviously going to run out a lot faster than before. Now, I do a lot of ink blending, and I still find that I can get a ton of use out of my ink pad before I need a refill. Probably a good year's worth of crafting before that's actually necessary with a felt pad. With a foam pad, it's definitely a little bit quicker. If you're a direct-to-paper person, now why do direct-to-paper? Well, for inks that do not have coordinating cardstock, I like the direct-to-paper technique. I can get a color cardstock that is perfectly matched to my stamp. This is going to waste your ink even quicker than the blending technique. So make sure that you get an ink refill if you plan on doing this technique often. Now, the one main exception to ink refills that I can say today are Distress and Distress Oxide inks. So I always invest in the refills. Well, Distress inks are designed to-do ink techniques. Now, the next thing you also have to consider is how often do I actually use my ink pads? If you're someone who doesn't do a ton of stamping and sticks to a certain color palette all the time, then it might just be worth investing in refills for your most used colors. Now, this might seem a little bit obvious, but the size of your inks are obviously going to determine whether you need to do a lot of refilling or not. If you buy the full ink pads in a felt ink pad, that baby's gonna last you a long time. But if you buy a mini cube, whether that be in felt or in foam, there's about 1/4 of the amount of ink that's in a full ink pad. So as much as it's nice because they're cheaper and they take up less space, if you're someone who uses your inks a lot, then a refill is probably necessary. But again, if you have a refill, it doesn't matter whether you have a cube or a full-size pad. So now that we've gone through all of the considerations, do you need an ink refill or not, and we have a good idea and can judge our collection, then let's go ahead and dive into the argument of, do I invest in a new ink pad or do I invest in a refill? Now, refills obviously need to be stored and they need to have a place. So if you're someone who uses primarily felt pads and you don't have a ton of space, then I would say in the long run, it's probably best for you to just buy a new ink pad rather than a refill, since they do take such a long time to actually empty. Now, when you're inking an ink pad, all it takes are a few little mini drops when you're adding them to your ink pad in order to re-ink it. So your re-inker is going to go such a long way. And not to mention all the techniques I'm going to show you in the next video, they are definitely handy to have in your craft room. And in the meantime, if you can't wait for another video, I definitely recommend checking out one of my videos in which I talk about the different types of black ink that are on the market and what you need them for. So be sure to check that out, and thank you so much for watching, everyone. Bye for now.